We have Xiaomi new 12 seconds Ultra, with a gigantic, self-proclaimed 1-inch camera sensor inside, the same size of sensor that sits inside of professional cameras. If we were to measure the internal sensor by the perimeter, the 1-inch image taker would have the footprint of this square, and if we measure diagonally, like on a TV, a true 1-inch sensor would look a bit more like this. The only way for sure though, to see if the sensor is actually 1 inch, is to rip the whole thing open and measure from the inside. So let's get started. I mean, with the size of the exterior circular camera lens on the back panel, it definitely makes you think that the camera might be large, but just like a lifted truck, it also could be an aesthetic distraction to conceal what's underneath. Removing the back panel is easy enough. Made from synthetic silicone leather, to mimic a camera body that is flexible. After slicing away the adhesive, the whole thing can peel up and away from the phone, exposing the triple camera setup underneath. All three cameras are protected by that large circle of exterior glass, and we can see that the main sensor, the important large camera, is off to the left of center. We can also see by the physical shape of that main camera housing that Xiaomi probably isn't measuring the sensor diagonally, and if Xiaomi's getting that 1-inch sensor measurement from the sides of the sensor, they are being extremely generous with that ruler. But I mean, who hasn't? It's too early to say for certain, but I'm starting to think that Xiaomi's 1-inch sensor isn't exactly 1 inch. Let's go deeper. To get to the battery connections, we have to remove 10 Phillips head screws on the back plastics, as well as detach the flash and light sensor ribbons before the rear plastics, and 50-watt wireless charging pad can come away from the phone. Below that we have the dual battery plugs, conveniently labeled 1 and 2. We can also unsnap the extension ribbons, just like a little Lego, and make our way down to the 7 screws, holding down the lower loudspeaker and bottom protective plastics. The lower stereo loudspeaker is pretty normal sized, nothing compared to the behemoth that we saw on AGM's recent phone, and of course, being a flagship, we do see little white balls inside, which help the speaker sound bigger than it actually is. All good things. I can pop off the fingerprint scanning ribbon, the lower ribbon extension, remove some signal wire connections, and the lower board can come loose, after which we can yoink out the USB-C port from the bottom of the phone. This guy is singular, unslaughtered, easy to replace, and provides the internal batteries with 67 watts of juice when plugged in. The remaining components in the lower portion of the phone are the waterproofing mesh screen over the loudspeaker, opening the square vibrator motor, as well as the white water damage indicator sticker next to the SIM card. Opening the battery is easy enough to remove. No prying or alcohol, just a little tug. Samsung could learn a thing or two from Xiaomi about attaching batteries. This guy is a 4,860 mAh capacity and has 2 plugs on top for the extra fast charging speeds. Now let's unbury the cameras. The motherboard of Xiaomi 12 seconds Ultra has a few signal wires, a singular screw holding down the camera units, and then the whole thing can lift up and out of the phone, leaving behind the upper loudspeaker and top portion of the vapor chamber for the liquid cooling. The rest of the vapor chamber extends down into the battery compartment, giving it enough surface area to help dissipate any heat out from the front of the phone through the screen. Removing the 3 camera modules from the motherboard is simple enough. There are 3 Lego-style ribbon cables, 2 on the front of the motherboard, and the third is wrapped around back, pinched down underneath a metal bracket. It's interesting back here as well that the processor actually has thermal paste, and then another copper plate that sits down inside a little square to help with the heat dissipation. I don't think we've ever seen a little copper extender unit like this. It's time to check out that triple camera setup. These 3 guys are all bound securely together inside of a metal housing, which keeps all 3 positioned correctly and working together as one. We'll bust open that metal housing and free the cameras from their captivity. Out of the frying pan into the fire, Xiaomi says. At this 48 megapixel periscope telephoto camera has internal optical image stabilization, and we're gonna see what that looks like from the inside. The telephoto camera works by moving the actual sensor farther away from the camera lens, just like what you would see with sports or nature photography. and they're really long lenses, which magnify the subject to get those close-up shots. This is the same concept, just a lot smaller, and it looks like the little copper coils on the sides are for that optical image stabilizing, for both the angled mirror portion and the lens portion of that periscope unit, both of which can be manipulated and stabilized from the inside with the side-mounted electromagnets. The telephoto sensor itself, the part that receives the light from the lens and transmits an image to be processed by the smartphone, is mounted at the end of the periscope. Finding this little square will give us a good comparison for when we dig out the theoretical 1-inch sensor from the main camera, which should also be pretty easy. Now of course, the camera isn't gonna survive this process, but that's never stopped us before. With the 1-inch sensor popped off the back, we do have access to the internal lens elements. It looks like both sides of the lens are made with plastic. I'm mostly just curious to see what they're made from, cause I know some photographers have a very strong preference to glass on professional camera lenses, but on something this small, glass is probably not super feasible. The main camera as well as optical image stabilization, also by using those same copper electromagnetic coils that interact with stationary magnets, inlaid into the sides of the lens elements. All pretty standard. Most smartphones have a YS these days, but now after tearing this all down, we have finally arrived at our destination, here at what Xiaomi is calling a full 1-inch sensor, which most smartphones do not have. As we can see, it is quite a bit larger than the tiny little guy we found inside of the periscope camera. A larger sensor generally means it can capture more light and theoretically produce a better image. Larger is better. But if we hold it up to my dimensionally accurate visual aids here, it is nowhere near 1 inch in size, neither by height nor diagonally, falling far short of the 1 inch in no matter what direction it's measured. Before we grab our pitchforks and riot. However, it turns out, when speaking about photography, videography, and image sensor sizes, is not so much about the physical dimensions at all, but actually more about the size of a circle that the sensor can fit inside of. Since old cameras 80 years ago used cylindrical cathode ray tubes, and that circular measurement around the sensor is what made sense to measure at the time, so that vernacular has persisted. Even though the digital technology we use now is far different. MKBH explained this pretty well in one of his videos. But while for us, the physical size is not actually 1 inch, in the photography world, this is still a very normal form of measurement, and Xiaomi is following those old school photography rules, just like every other camera out there. At the moment, it's an antique relic from the olden days. That just doesn't really make sense anymore. But we still keep it around, for some reason, like the floppy disk icon, fax machines, or members of Congress. I'm not totally sure. The Xiaomi 12 seconds Ultra will still work once we put it all back together, since we've destroyed parts of it, but it's been very interesting to see how everything is assembled from the inside and learn a bit of history at the same time. Surprisingly, the phone does still turn on, but since we went from a 1-inch sensor to a no-inch sensor, the 12's Ultra is unable to find my cameras. We can tell that they are scattered to bits all over my desk, but we don't need to tell the phone that. So while we've discovered that the sensor itself might not be a full physical 1 inch in size, it's still very impressive. But that leaves the question for you. Do you think camera sensors should be measured differently now that we aren't using the old cathode ray tubes anymore? Or should we continue to let the camera industry be overly generous with the rulers? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button